Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Imsin Peng from the University of Sydney. I'm zooming in today from the land of the Darug people, and the university sits in the land of the Gadigal people. We pay our respect to all past, present, and future traditional owners of the land. Today is our very first Thailand social science research seminar 22. That comes out of the Asia Pacific. As you know, TS4 webinars feature scholars that focus on Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and we're planning to add a few more other countries that do excellent work from around the world. And we try our best to accommodate various different time zones. So this particular series where Eli is speaking as a first speaker focuses on scholars that are based in the Asia Pacific. We're very fortunate today to have also our very first anthropologist in the series. So Dr. Eli Elinoff is the senior lecturer from the School of Social and Cultural Studies at the Teherangawaga in the northeastern part of Thailand. He's a political environmental anthropologist with research projects that look at Thailand, but also broadly in Southeast Asia, that looks at citizenship, space, urbanization, aesthetics, infrastructure, architecture, and the built environment, as well as environmental change. A number of his projects have been funded and feature in a number of international conferences, but the most important one that he would highlight today in his talk is part of his book that has been recently published last year at the University of Hype called Citizen Designs, City Making and Democracy in Northeastern Thailand. So I'll let Eli start his talk. He has about 20 minutes or so to questions in the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Aim. And just a special thank you to the people hosting the Thailand Social Science Seminar Series, especially the Nordic Institute for Asian Studies, the New York Southeast Asia Network, the Sydney Southeast Asian Studies Center, and most importantly, UAM. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share my recent book, which is it's really fun to be able to share that today. I'm just going to go ahead here and share my screen so I can get started with the bulk of the talk. So my aim today is to focus on the broad arguments that are contained in the book. I won't spend too much time on the specifics of the empirics here or the data or the methods, but I'm happy to really dive into that in the question and answer if people are interested. But today I really want to give a high level sense of what the arguments and the implications of the book as I see them are. I've included lots of photos along the way as illustrative and all the images are my own. So with that being said, I'm just going to dive right in. Citizen Designs at its heart is a book about politics. It's about what that practice means and how it becomes necessary, particularly for people who are poor and excluded, to remake their lives and polities. It's also more specifically a book about Thai politics at a particularly volatile moment, with research occurring mainly between 2007 and 2017. In a particular place, Khon Kaen, the capital of Northeastern Thailand, about particular people, in this case, settlers who have built their homes and lives along the railway tracks running through that city and have lived there for more than a half of a century and are now in many ways facing pressure and eviction based on new rail projects. Citizen Designs explores these themes through long-term ethnographic study of the interactions between residents of the railway communities, city officials, NGO activists, and community architects initiating the nationwide participatory housing policy known as Ban Man Kong. Combining both historical and ethnographic modes of analysis, the book offers an intimate portrait of the ways residents struggles to secure rights to their homes built on land owned by the State Railway of Thailand, articulated with both local projects of urban improvement and national debates around the horizons of democracy. To make sense of these questions, I trace the answers out through paying attention to what I call distinct citizen designs. And this is a concept I developed to bring together a range of future-oriented social and political visions of social and political belonging. And I trace these as they intersect and were acted upon in Khon Kaen. So by following the trajectories of these various citizen designs, it enables me to compare residents' aspirations for political equality and social equality with policymakers' notions of docile and harmonious citizens, with NGO activist visions of a mobilized political poor, identifying places in which those different kinds of political projects overlap and places where they sit in tension with one another. So beyond simply considering these as imaginaries of belonging, that is to say, designs that are confined to the mind, the book takes them up as designs that people act upon with material things. Primarily things that are related to housing, like concrete, tin, tile, brick, and glass, but also everyday practices and through tense political coalitions used to advance local and national disagreements like the one in this picture. In this sense, the book also explores what it means to pursue a decent life in 21st century Thailand, and whether and how politics, a practice that has long been deferred from people like those living along the tracks, might be a means of achieving such a thing. So through detailed ethnographic description, I describe how aspirations among the poor to assert their equal political capacities recompose the spaces along the tracks, transforming them into a landscape of thoughts, designs, coalitions, debates, dreams, practices, and disagreements over what democracy is and what it might yet be. In this sense, the book is also presents arguments about democracy in general, how it's made, how it feels, and where it often finds its limits, rubbing up against existing histories of inequality, exclusion, and subordination. The ethnographic material that the book is based on spans, as followers of Thai politics will know, spans periods of electoral democracy, mass mobilization, state violence, and military repression. But rather than consider these shifts at a strictly national level, it explores their effects at local and intimate scales, considering how various kinds of citizens working and living in Khon Kaen attempted to enact democracy at the level of the nation, the city, the community, the house, and the body. In doing so, it emphasizes the way that democracy is a living system built out of attempts by various types of citizens to make such a thing across these different scales. By thinking across scales, I show how political ideals like equality became bound up with efforts to manage democratic politics. These binds are evident in even the most participatory forms of policymaking, like the Ban Man Kong project, which is at the heart of the book. That project promised that participation in collective projects of urban renewal and housing improvement would not only improve the homes that poor people lived in, but also the quality of their citizenship, and in the process generate a more harmonious nation. As I showed, the outcomes of that policy were, by its own standards, ambiguous. Residents took to the project to improve their situation, but also used it to amplify disagreements rather than to pacify them. Similarly, policymakers use that project as a mode of organizing communities, but not necessarily giving full rise to their political voice. So on the one hand, these complexities reflect some things that are specific to Thai history. Citizens, both like those living along the tracks in Khon Kaen and like the red shirts, among whom many of the people along the tracks found affiliation, are comprised of the poor, the provincial, ethnically Lao, kind of ambiguously rural and urban, the working classes, and in many cases, the aspirational lower middle classes, people who have gained a foothold in the national economy over the last 3 decades of economic transformation, but not found themselves fully included in its political community. And I show how these groups have been confined by overlapping sociocultural renderings of hierarchy and histories of developmentalist exclusion that consign these sorts of actors to the realm of not yet ready for citizenship. Such renderings reflect long-standing forms of political inequality that characterize the poor as villagers, and related forms of structural economic inequality that have kept these groups from becoming equal in other regards. This political deferral, that not yet, relegated these actors to being seen as unfit for participation, unready for democracy, producing not only widespread discrimination, but also propelling successive incursions into electoral democracy, justifying military rule and political violence against those who would speak out. In this framework, coups like the one that began in 2014 and continues now in the guise of the current military government appear justified as the middle classes and the well-born attempt to save the poor from what they see as their worst instincts. In this sense, democracy is merely seen as disorderly conflict. The pervasive economic, political, and social double standards that structure the internal exclusions that shape local articulations of the problem of democracy, like the famous formulation of Thai-style democracy, and produce various ideas about how to solve it through managed forms of participation, are evidence of this kind of attitude towards democratic politics. Ultimately, they end up linking making for strange pairings, like linking the forms of managed participation and inclusive city making that are at the heart of the book with military coups, kind of unlikely pairs in that case. They also produce new anxieties about claims to equality that people like those living along the tracks and the red shirts have attempted to make across the last 15 years. In this way, the book speaks to all the things that continue to animate much debate across Thailand. So on the one hand, the book speaks very much to contemporary Thai politics. On the other, these kinds of internal exclusions and fears about democratic aspirations seem to be endemic to democracy itself. The historian Don Herzog's exploration of English conservatism and the rise of conservatism in general in response to the French revolutions at the end of the 18th and the turn of the 19th century reveals how anti-democratic conservatism emerged in England from fears about the poor and the aspiring lower classes taking up democracy, and in so doing, acting out of place and speaking out of turn. As Herzog describes, barbershops, pubs, hairdressers, coffee shops all served as places where the poor fomented their own democratic aspirations and made new claims on the emerging British state. In this context of 18th century and 19th century England, the lower orders and their aspirations for equality and the spaces within which those claims were debated were thus objects of upper class derision, scorn, and fear. They were seen as hotbeds, upending the perceived naturalness of the British social hierarchy. In 21st century Thailand, community meetings, participatory planning workshops, DIY projects, as well as backyards, front porches, gardens, dusty lots, restaurants, and the gaps on the sides of railway tracks became potent sites for people to think through and debate the implications and meanings of democracy, and specifically to think through its redistribution of political capacity. These became sites to question the meaning of citizenship and to argue about the value of politics as a means of achieving social equality. They were also spaces to imagine and act upon other distributions of political capacity and to work towards other political orders. So by exploring these scenes in the context of residents' struggles to secure their place in the city, Citizen Designs demonstrates how deep and complex conversations about democracy have been occurring in many places, in places that many Thais assume lack the capacity for such discussions. Debates about democracy led to transformative actions, both sustained and momentary, that opened up much more complex questions about politics, citizenship, and the city by allowing residents in Khon Kaen and their collaborators to consider in real terms the wider implications of equality. They were forced, for example, to consider what forms of inclusion matter, whether and how people's voices got heard or whether they were silenced, and what happens when people do not wish to participate. They were also pushed to wade into messy disagreements that unfolded from these questions in their neighborhoods and homes. These were experienced near intimate encounters with democratic change. Attention to these scenes reveals a diverse range of opinions about what it means to make a democracy from the inside. It also revealed what it means when citizens like those central to this book attempt to act on their own political wills to take up politics like everyone else. The results have been complex, partial, and remain deeply unfinished, especially as communities are facing new rounds of relocation and eviction due to the incoming high-speed rail projects. But they also reflect fundamental insights into the character of democracy as a way of being in the world. Here, I think Thailand and Khon Kaen have much to add to our understanding of democracy itself. More than simply demonstrating the contours of democratic aspirations along the tracks or highlighting the scenes of backlash among conservative reformers, Citizen Designs offers a complex picture of new forms of governance that emerge to manage the poor and their politics through inclusion in the period that followed Thailand's democratic opening beginning in the 1990s. While those policies often challenged the democratic sensibilities of residents, they also sought to extend democracies in new ways to new places. At the same time, they enrolled new actors, in this case, young, educated provincial architects, to act as visionaries of democratic designs and agents of local political management. The community architects that I followed, including some of the folks pictured here, initiated the Ban Man Khong project through these sorts of local workshops and planning sessions. They understood the political possibilities of participation, but they were also keenly aware of its limits. They recognized their abilities to build and support the claims of the communities they worked with, but they also knew the limits their work placed on those claims, that they could never reach the actual issues that residents sought to address. Nevertheless, those architects too worked towards these projects with the aim of acting upon democratic aspirations, even while they learned the pitfalls of such a thing. In this sense, democratic design without politics turns out to not be democratic at all, but also another mode of policing. The political limitations of Ban Man Khong have had some extremely dire effects in Khon Kaen, which has become visible as new rail projects have entailed a renewal of mass eviction and the amplification of uncertainties up and down the tracks. As I describe in the book's final section, new rail projects and a rush of urban growth in the city after the 2014 coup pushed residents along the tracks out to the city's margins once again, in wetlands, open tracts of land, and purloined plots, which have once again served as the grounding for the poor as they continue to stake their legitimacy as residents of the city and citizens of the nation. Design in this sense was not a magic technique for revisioning the world, but was instead a historically laden practice itself, composed of existing power structures and contentious debates about the appropriate forms of politics and the good life. Design provided a means of acting towards these contested futures in ways that renewed old hierarchies, just as it sometimes provided new grounds to contest them. Residents, for their part, understood the possibilities and limitations of projects like Ban Man Khong as well. They saw the ways it could support and extend their democratic forces, but also understood how it limited them. I show through a variety of examples how residents engaged with, critiqued, and challenged that project, and the ways it sought to manage their claims, even as they conformed to its expectations and designs in order to access new money in hopes of legitimizing their presence in the city. They challenged ideas of community and yet still longed for such a thing to be possible. Through their work, the policy became a site within which to experiment with democratic being, and also a space in which they discovered the substantive limits of their own political capacities. So by exploring the period of Thai politics spanning 2007 to 2017 in this way, the book seeks to complicate the often schematic picture of Thai democracy, which presents hardened groups struggling against each other with the aim of advancing democratic or undemocratic modes of governing and being, instead opting for a mode of narration rooted in unresolved and perhaps unresolvable disagreements. It also directly challenges ideas that the poor are incapable of thinking as or acting as autonomous political beings. The book highlights how politics along the tracks advanced through unfinished contestations that were taken up in multiple complex acts of disagreement, both public and private. By looking at democracy in this granular way, we find out that democracy and the political order itself are contingent formulations. Rather than being fixed, they're subject to being made and remade, emerging out of changing capacities of citizens embedded in histories of unfinished disagreements. In this sense, I see struggles like those taking place along the tracks in Khon Kaen as deeply tied to the unfinished debates and struggles that are taking place in Thailand's capital in Bangkok, even if they're not exactly the same thing. Thinking about the political as open, unfinished, and contingent, I think, gives a more adequate space for the complexity of people's unfolding relationship with democracy. It also opens possibilities for actors to reformulate themselves, their ideas, their relationships with one another, and to drive holes in even the most calcified forms of power, or in fact, to return to prop up old orders in times of crisis, as we've also seen. The promise of equality remains unrealized in Thailand as it does elsewhere, but it remains real nevertheless. It's my hope that sustained attention to practices of disagreement along Khon Kaen's railway tracks offers a way of thinking ourselves closer towards realizing that promise. Although my friends and collaborators in Khon Kaen at the agency initiating Ban Man Khong and within Thailand's NGO network continue to debate what democracy is, Their work reflects the uncertainty that always comes along with politics. The desires of residents and activists and architects to redesign the city as a space for democracy were real, even if they were limited and sometimes contradictory. This book attempts to put none of these the questions raised by these debates to rest. Instead, by taking on the political in Thailand from within its gnarled twists and uncertain trajectories, I endeavor to present democracy as doggedly open, even when it has seemed most foreclosed. In some sense, I think we can think about the contemporary student movements as heirs to this political will as well, though as yet the articulation between those powerful and incredibly brave movements and the political actors I describe in Citizen Designs is not yet fully realized. As my informants pointed out to me on more than one occasion, neither the 2014 coup nor the period that followed have successfully erased their own sense of political autonomy. Their persistent will to disagree suggests that far greater transformation are still possible. It's my hope that Citizen Designs as a text not only preserves this sense of possibility, but also extends and transforms our ideas of what Thai politics are and what they might yet be. The book is available now through University of Hawaii Press. You can get it there or at any of your major booksellers if you're keen to read it after hearing that short description. I'm going to stop sharing so we can jump into a question and answer. Thank you.
Whilst we're waiting for Dr. Emerson Beng to join us in the Zoom session again, she's having some technical issues. I might kick off a Q&A and ask Eli to answer our first question, which is from Lamberto Pilatan Jr., who says, "Good morning, sir. How do you describe Thai democracy based on the quality of leaders, policy decision-making, political parties, and people participation? What are its strong and weak points? Thank you."
Thanks for that question, Lamberto. It's quite a broad range of questions. I don't approach democracy as a political scientist. Instead, I tend to approach it from the ground up as an anthropologist would. So I'm interested in the ways in which people tend to think about that on their own and then act on it in their own everyday lives. So the way that I've approached it and thought about it are not necessarily through evaluative techniques to think about, well, you know, to put Thailand on a kind of democratic ranking, but rather to think through the ways in which people themselves use that term. And often they use it in relatively simple but evocative ways to talk about questions of equality, to think about issues related to exclusion and exclusion, to talk about the distributions of benefits and harms or exposure to violence, or who has the capacity to avoid punishment for their actions. So in that context, I think that one of the pervasive ways that we've seen, one of the kind of common ways that we've seen Thai democracy portrayed is as a highly unequal system and as one that's increasingly restricted through specific laws and over time increasingly constrained as a kind of institutional system. So that's the way that I've tended to approach it. And rather than kind of give an evaluative approach, the book gives an ethnographic portrait of the ways that people have thought about that on their own. That's how I would sort of think through that question in my own way.
Thanks, Eli. I'll move on to the second question, which has been submitted by Angel III Ohastro, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, who says, "Peace and order seem to remain as largely aspirational because, as you said, there is a growing movement for more participatory governance activities at the community level. However, small and based and on their needs to have better livelihood and housing, which are largely economic and social elements. Do you think that the military government would still be able to find synchronicity in its security-based approach with the growing movement for participatory governance?"
I think peace and order are discourses in Thailand that have both long histories and specific social valences. So to the extent that discourses around peace and order preclude deeper participation or tend to suppress or stifle dissent or dissenting opinions or contentious thought, then I think that it's impossible to harmonize the two ends of that aspiration. But I guess to extend that question is to say that harmonizing those two ends of those aspirations doesn't seem to be the point of a democratic system. And what I see both in the kinds of aspirations of the people that I've worked with and in the current movements based in the current student movements is an increasing sense that increasing agitation for difference, disagreement, to be the foundation of a new social good, rather than to see them as kind of mutually exclusive, impossible to reconcile, impossible to reconcile goods. The increasing sense is that disagreement, debate, even contentious encounters are necessary for Thailand to be able to have a stable and progressive government. And I think that that's fundamental to this kind of holding these different moments together as a kind of a turn towards disagreement as a social good, which is, I think, quite new.
Thanks, Eli. I'll move on to the next question, which has been submitted by Jin Hee Lim, who's a first-year PhD student and is interested in looking at how highways in northern Thailand, and notably along the Thai-Myanmar borderlands, affect the lives of the hill tribe, the Chao Khao people. In other words, how do the people experience the state through infrastructure? Did you also see cases in which the local communities experienced development projects differently according to their legal or social status?
Yeah, that's a great question. Infrastructure turns out to be a really important space of encounter between all kinds of people in the state. And projects like highways, the railway in Khon Kaen, dams in Isan have always been sites in which differential equality or inequality comes to the fore, but they also oftentimes create occasions for provocation, for their instigations for politics. And so what we see across these cases is a kind of a clustering effect where infrastructure projects enable or propel political encounters that are sometimes quite transformative. Other times they result in the kind of extension or deepening of inequality, the expropriation or dispossession of people from their land are all common occurrences with infrastructural politics. Nevertheless, as kind of analysts, if you're looking to understand the relationship between, so on the one hand, as in social experience for people living there, it can produce opportunities to make new claims to the state, but that also opens these communities up to profound sorts of disruptive violence. So as analysts, so they're quite dangerous, even if there are sometimes some political promise in them. But as analysts, they also create possibilities to reflect on those conditions of politics for different types of citizens. So for people living in northern Thailand, those different kinds of highway policies will initiate or extend particular kinds of state forms and enable us to think about how those are operating in the current moment.
Hi, I'm back. Next question from Liam Lefferts. Eli, continuing discussion on democracy, do they use the word democracy or Prachadhipatai as often as you? Are the meanings in any way the same? Even here in the US, democracy is a field for contestation. Do the Thai Isan people agree on what they are talking about?
Liam, lovely to see you. Thanks for joining in the talk. I think that, in fact, as I said in the first question, my answer to the way that I've approached democracy is to take it as undefined and open, as a emerging and evolving social category that people use to think about their own experience with. So in many ways, it is undefined. In the first instance, I think my sense is that people use it to refer to forms of inequality, exclusion, and differential treatment. So democracy seems to be a form of social good that entails inclusion, equality, and equal treatment. And I think largely that's the kind of impulse guiding people's uses of it. What it means in practice is, as the book shows, quite variable. So I'm interested in those expressions of equality to kind of use a phrase that the political theorist Jacques Rancière uses, is a kind of democracy as an expression of equality, and to think about what unfolds as from that expression first, rather than to apply a kind of a narrower institutional definition. And that to me has enabled an approach to Thai politics that feels to reflect the kind of liveliness of it, rather than the expectation of arrival, which seemed to dominate kind of the understandings of democracy in Thailand in the 1980s and 90s, that Thailand would arrive through various channels to a stable and consolidated democratic order. In the period that scholars like myself and AIM have been working, we've seen that arrival collapse, be remade, collapse, reformulate itself, again and again. So it's been necessary, I think, to shift our sense of what that means. And also, I think, in that way, to open up the possibility that Thailand and these struggles on the ground are in fact reformulating democracy in particularly important ways that actually reflect the sorts of points that you make about the US, that in the US it's undefined and open as well, and that what we see there is that the social order consolidates and collapses and is being remade actively, and that requires a certain form of citizenship. It requires a certain sense of belonging and attunement to questions of equality. And I think that's fundamental to debates around democracy in the US, and it's fundamental to debates around democracy in Thailand. And neither in that case ends up having a kind of being a consolidated locus of advanced democracy, but rather these places in which that idea is constantly being worked on.
Okay, great. We might come back to this democracy question again. There's another person asking this, but let's move on to another focus. It's a focus on the community along the railway. Visitya is asking, why do you choose to study community along the railway? Why are you interested in this kind of livelihood? How does this kind of infrastructure address local or even Southeast Asia regional tension in relation to democracy or politics?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I came to the communities along the railway tracks in a couple of different ways. First, these were intriguing spaces to me. One, because of their the kind of spatial, they kind of occupied an unusual spatial seam throughout Khon Kaen that collapse in important ways: socioeconomic transformation, political exclusion, and local transformation in ways that I found just to be quite that seemed to be important, but I wasn't quite sure why. What it seemed to be important in that space was over time was that the way in which all of these different actors, histories of NGOs dating back to the mid-1990s, and histories of local organization during really the same period, but also slightly earlier around anti-eviction movements, had really transformed a number of people's senses of their relationship with the state. They'd begun negotiating with the state railway and initiating kind of revolutionary new lease agreements where these communities could begin to occupy their land legally for the first time. And those changes initiated wider sets of questions around who the residents tended to reflect on their own about who they were in a wider stake within the state. So that was sort of the initial impulse. The second impulse was that there was this ongoing intervention into these places, using participation, attempting to amplify people's claims to citizenship through state projects of local improvement. That is to say, this Ban Man Kwang project, which used local participation, participatory design, participatory construction processes, micro loans, a kind of whole suite of what we might think of as kind of the kind of best practices of development starting at the kind of turn of the millennia, were all in operation in new ways in places and in sites along the tracks. So it seemed a kind of a fertile space to think about a number of these questions as they converged, thinking about what citizenship meant was what actually people living there were doing. So these different projects coalesced around those questions. And I felt that the railway tracks themselves provided an opportunity and a kind of thick site to explore these different ideas in different ways.
That's great. All right, next question from Apishai Sunjinda. Has the new proposed high-speed rail that are planned to be built, which will pass through Khon Kaen, trigger renewed local citizen activism along the railway path like what it did earlier? If so, how similar or different are they? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. It reflects upon, I think, the current condition of politics in Thailand in a nice way. What the high-speed rail system, I mean, initially, a lot of the changes we see with high-speed rail were ushered in 2015 with the construction of the elevated railway line that runs through the city now. That project required the kind of installation of sort of large concrete pillars upon which the track sat upon. And that ultimately initiated the eviction of around 200 families. What we see in the current period is an extension of some of the number of the conflicts that we saw that I describe in the book, in which you have kind of multiple situations going up and down the tracks. You have some communities, primarily those that have worked with the activist 4-region slum network, who have signed either temporary renewable leases to the land. And those communities have a current active stake in both demanding compensation, but also negotiating the possibilities of being able to stay. There are also other communities that either for a variety of reasons that I also describe in the book, chose not to or discontinued their involvement in the NGO organizing project or never joined that organizing group in the first place. This is a quite diverse set of choices around alliances that have taken place along the tracks in Khon Kaen. And those groups are facing really a quite imminent threat of eviction. So there are kinds of questions around expropriation, compensation, and relocation, all of which are taking place in a kind of long and kind of drawn out sets of negotiations, which in many ways reflect the sorts of things that we see in that I describe in the book. But one of the key differences at this point is that it's become much more difficult to wage a public struggle and a public disagreement and to have that find any support. So both activists and the communities have had to really work within the kinds of negotiating strategies of playing these different bureaucracies in relationship to one another. And that they're pros at this. There's a kind of a long history of these different kinds of negotiations. So, the outcome of it is unforeseen, but it's certainly the kind of constrictions that we see on public political protests, on public dissent, have important effects and have had important effects in local struggles as well as national struggles.
Great. Next question from Larry Ashman. Hi, Eli, thanks. So the question is, do people residing along the railroad qualify to vote?
Yeah, in many cases, yes, they do, simply. Some people maintain housing registrations in other places. They may not vote in Khon Kaen. They may vote elsewhere. Most of the communities since the middle of the 1990s have had temporary housing registrations, which allows them to vote in Khon Kaen. And so, yes, they do vote, but it's differential in terms of where and under what conditions they do that, but yes.
I mean, there's no question to this, but I'm also curious, so I just want to ask,
Mm.
how did you, as an anthropologist, who's also a Farang, right, who's non-native, how do you even approach the communities in the beginning and said, hey, would love to talk about your life? What did you do, Eli?
That's a nice question. You know, and this kind of happened in a couple of ways. My first experience in Khon Kaen was as a study abroad student, and I was really introduced to the community networks that way when I was 20 years old. Those community networks were in place then and were ongoing. So that was one of the first ways that I got to know some of the NGOs, at least initially, in a kind of passing manner. The second way that I did that was really through working through the Community Organizations Development Institute, which is the organization in charge of the Ban Man Kong project. And by working with them, working alongside them and getting to know their community architects and some of the academics working with them, I was introduced into the community, a number of different, the kind of the other side of their community networks in Khon Kaen, and those, through the leaders of those communities, I ended up just spending a lot of time and kind of doing the kind of long-term work of just showing up over and over and over again and becoming a familiar face. And I think, and that was really the way that I sort of generated relationships in order to sustain the research in the way that it has been sustained.
Not easy to do now with all the restrictions, but hopefully we can get back to some degree.
Yeah, certainly not easy to do. And also, I think at the great generosity of all the people that invited me in and were patient and interested enough to share their stories with me and to kind of think alongside me about these questions.
So getting back to the other question on democracy from Eric White, could you describe briefly some of the contrasting visions of democratic participation and agency pursued by your informants over the decade of your research, and whether some were more successful than others, either in the short or long term?
Sure. The primary contrast that I sort of, thanks Eric, and also nice to see you here in virtual form. The primary contrast that I explore, or that I kind of draw out in the book, are between the groups that sought to enact democracy alongside and through channels like the 4-Region Slum Network, who organize themselves as an independent activist organization, whose primary aim is, whose stated primary aim is for residents to pursue their political, to enact their political voice, to work on the behalf of the urban poor, and in that way to pursue land rights as a kind of initial strategy. Through that organization, groups tend to focus on, they tended to emphasize achieving and signing legal access, legal rights to their land with the State Railway of Thailand first, and verifying their citizenship in a sense through the kind of active negotiation with the SRT and the expression, at least from the activist perspective, of their political capacities to negotiate a legitimate land claim. And in that case, as I said, those residents have secured both a long-term right to the land, but also an important negotiating tool in those lease agreements that has been, I think, really quite crucial to their capacity to be seen as interlocutors, not being removed immediately or evicted or expropriated without negotiation first. So that, I think, was a kind of one version of it. That was for maybe, I guess we'll say maybe about 8 years or about 8 to 10 years. That was kind of the primary channel of organizing in Khon Kaen, was through those activist networks. In the early 2000s, the arrival of the Community Organizations Development Institute and the Ban Man Kong project posed other opportunities for people and enabled the development of a second parallel network that another set of communities and another set of community organizers emerged to control. And that was a network that was plugged directly into the Community Organizations Development Institute's sort of project apparatus, we'll say. That group understood their citizenship as being a more direct form of practice. rather than seeing themselves in either alliance with an NGO group or working, or in fact, in their terms, working underneath NGO activists. They saw themselves as expressing their own will much more directly, negotiating with the Community Organizations Development Institute as a state agency and expressing their own political capacity in that sense. These different visions entailed different ideas about what good citizenship was for people working in, and I'm going to talk about this, it's much more complicatedly laid out in the book, but in a kind of schematic sense, for the residents that tended to work with the 4-region slum network, protest, confrontation, agitation tended to be seen as social goods, but oftentimes there was ambiguity understood about the relationship between those social goods and the NGOs that they were working with. For the people that worked directly with Cody, there was a kind of willingness to participate, to be seen as harmonious, and to work directly with this, but also through working directly with the state, they also saw that as an expression of their own autonomous capacities in ways that working in alliances with NGOs wasn't as autonomous. So, you know, it's these kind of different versions of participation, different versions of who gets to lead, of whose voices get to be heard, of whose ideas get to be expressed, how people get to stop participating, in fact, becomes a really interesting question. At what point does one achieve the capacity to be a demobilized regular citizen, an apolitical citizen, in fact? So all of these questions arise. And, you know, again, as I kind of pointed out in the talk, my aim wasn't to put those questions to rest in a kind of simple schematic model, but rather to let them sit in tension with one another. Because what we see across these different alliances is a lot of shifting around and a lot of debate. And I think that's, in a sense, suggestive of the liveness of that category of democracy, the liveness of the relationship with politics that's been evolving across the last decade. And these things are always, you know, in further relationship with social movements going on in Bangkok with the red shirts and with the yellow shirts. I think, you know, those things also refract and help people think about what democracy was for them at various points. So that's the kind of picture of these different trajectories and different ideas that are at play in the book.
All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions and that's it. So next is Phil Hirsch. To what extent has the framing of democracy as a local struggle been contextualized within the network movements such as the P-Move or Assembly of the Poor? Are there issues of democracy representation within these wider movements?
Hi, Phil. That's a really nice and complicated question. You know, I think that P-Move, Assembly of the Poor, the 4-region slum network, framed democracy in a fashion of developing, my sense is that they frame democracy in the fashion of developing and cultivating the power of the poor as autonomous and distinct from political parties and as distinct from mass social movements. Those movements across time, their relationship and their understandings of their relationship with the military itself is diverse. And there's a kind of different kinds of understandings of how those different political movements overlap with or relate to different, you know, other social movements like the PAD or the PDRC or any of those wider these wider movements, or the red shirts, for example. In the most recent years, I see a quite kind of an emerging alignment that was probably different than 10 years ago between the student movements in Bangkok and really broadly all over the country. At this point, it's not accurate to say that they're merely in Bangkok, but the nationwide student movements, and a kind of emerging alignment, although not yet complete alignment between those two spaces. But I think that's a really interesting scene to think about and to consider what those alignments look like and where they overlap and where they don't. I think one of the key modes of tension between these two different networks that I follow in the book is precisely around the second question. Your second question is, are there issues of democracy or representation within these wider movements? This is a key node of tension, and part of the reason for the split in Khon Kaen is around precisely that, whether different actors felt that their voices were being listened to, or whether they felt like they were being forced to participate in a social movement that they didn't believe in. And this again has very different and diverse sets of answers, but it's nevertheless was responsible for the actual division between the 4 regions led group and the other groups that I was working with. So, you know, I think that question is something that's not, it's an open question of what it means to belong to a pro-poor social movement and how those movements organize themselves and the relationship between different kinds of participants in those structures. You know, that's something that it depends on who you're talking to frequently, how they describe that relationship and what that relationship means and the extent of what that network means. In some cases, people would say, well, you know, we work together on local issues, but for me, my affiliations, my wider affiliations are not about these local social movements around housing. I also see myself as a part of the red shirt movement, or I also see myself as a part of another movement, which that group seeks to try to, you know, actively push us into a different kind of political struggle. So, you know, I think it's those tensions, you know, again, these are the interesting tensions that are composing this democratic struggle. They're not decided and they're not, you know, in any sense finished. And what we see, especially in the last several years, is those tensions may be working themselves out in a different way than they were, you know, in 2008, 9, 10, when they might have been much more pitched. There might be more convergence over the next few years. It just depends, you know, I think we'll have to wait and see what happens there.
I think I'm going to wrap up here by leaving a last question for you to actually share with us your new project on concrete, because it's super interesting. And I think if we you know, I think it's, yeah, we want to hear a little bit more about a little excerpt of your new project.
Sure. Thanks for giving me the chance to give that a wee plug as well. Right now, and really since 2014, I've been actively following, kind of tracing the history and then present, and in fact, the future of the built environment in Thailand through looking at the kind of ecological spaces constructed and composed of concrete. And this has been a kind of multi-sided ethnographic project that kind of brings us from the spaces of cement production, quarry spaces in places like Saraburi, into manufacturing spaces, into really the edges of the city. Specific here in this case, I'm tended to be focusing the project in Bangkok. These kinds of edges of the city where there's encounters between hard and soft infrastructures, and then further moving outwards to think alongside architects and urban planners who are imagining post-concrete cities, thinking about livability, urban trees, and their relationship with the hardscape built environment, and artists using concrete and cement to reflect upon, as a kind of medium to reflect upon Thai politics and the urban condition broadly. So it's a quite massive and really diverse research design that's, I think, very different to citizen designs. But my aim is to really try to use or to think within these different spaces about different practices, trying to understand or work towards making life within Thailand, which we all know is a kind of incredibly vulnerable space to the effects of climate change. What is that going to look like, and how are people anticipating that? And what are the kind of nodes of hard or choke points of urbanization around the material environment, and how are those being managed in the present context?
That's wonderful. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially Eli for sharing with us his work. And I do hope that you do get to go back there soon. It's really difficult to do in-depth, nuanced anthropological work without being there for extended period of time. And we did get a question about that from one of the students. You know, how do we do research today in this kind of environment? It's not easy, right?
No, it's not easy. I mean, I think everybody's trying to work with heterogeneous strategies, blending live, you know, Zoom, social media. I mean, AIM, in many ways, your work was on the cutting edge of all this, anticipating it long before we ended up in these little squares. But yeah, it's
But
not
there's
an
a
easy time
lot,
to be doing
yeah,
this.
it's a lot of things you can't grasp when you're
Yeah.
not physically with another person.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think we all have to triangulate methods and research and be able to be flexible to
Yeah.
account for all the challenges that we all face as researchers today. So thank
Yeah,
you
I
very
think-
much, everyone. Yeah, sorry, Eli.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. It was really a lot of fun. And thanks to all the great questions, and provocative and nice to think alongside some people about this book. I'm looking forward to hearing people's responses to it when they read it.
So where can we buy it, Eli?
It's available at all your major booksellers, but you can get it directly from the publisher, University of Hawaii, or Amazon Book Depository, wherever you get your books.
That sounds good. Thank you. Do you know if it's going to be available online as well?
Yeah,
As
I think
an
it is.
ebook?
Yeah, it's available in an ebook, paperback, hardcover,
Perfect.
all the forms. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Eli, and thank you everybody for joining in today. Hopefully you can join us for our future TS4 seminars. Have a lovely day.
Thanks.
Bye.